program is the Active Center.
Today, we are wading into one of the most intense debates in the American West, California's water. It's a fight that really boils down to a war of numbers, a clash of absolute necessities, and two totally different stories about the exact same, very precious resource. All right, let's get into it.
This is it. This is the explosive claim at the heart of the whole thing. If you talk to farmers in the Central Valley, they'll tell you that this vital resource is being intentionally wasted, just flushed away. But is that what's really happening? Well, the answer, it turns out, depends completely on who you ask.
So on one hand, you have this staggering 95% number, but on the other, the state government gives you a totally different figure, 50%. How on earth can both of these numbers exist at the same time? I mean, one of them has to be wrong, right? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to piece together in this explainer.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this fight, we first have to understand the water itself. Let's just take a step back and break down where California's water actually goes in a typical year. So if you zoom way out, the state's developed water supply is pretty much split right down the middle. About half goes to what we call human use, so water for our cities and our farms. The other half is specifically set aside for the environment. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's look closer at that human use half of the pie. A whopping 80% of that water goes to agriculture. The other 20%, well, that goes to all the cities and urban areas combined. And that right there is why farmers are so absolutely central to this entire debate. So what about that other 50%? The environmental water. It's really easy to look at that and think, well, that's just wasted water, but it's actually doing some critical jobs. This water flow isn't optional. It's legally required to keep rivers healthy, to support endangered fish, and, this is a big one, to act as a giant hydraulic barrier, physically pushing saltwater from the ocean away from the freshwater pumps that supply millions of us. Okay, so with that context in mind, let's turn to the first side in this fight, the view from the farms of California's Central Valley, which is, by the way, one of the most productive farming regions on the entire planet. This quote from a farmer named Jason Gianelli just captures that frustration perfectly. From their perspective, they see these massive amounts of fresh water literally flowing right past them and out to the ocean, often when they need it the most. And that 95% figure, believe me, it is not pulled out of thin air. It comes from a very specific, and for farmers, a truly infuriating experience, watching the water system fail to capture nearly all the water from a major storm right when they're in the middle of a drought. And here's why they see it that way. During these big storms, the huge pumps that send water south are often legally required to be shut down, sometimes to just 20% of their full power. Now, these rules are there to protect endangered fish, like salmon and the Delta Smelt. But for farmers, this isn't protection. It's a regulatory chokehold that wastes a resource that could and should be captured and stored. All right, now let's flip the coin and look at this from the state's perspective. Because regulators and environmental groups aren't just looking at one storm. They're trying to manage this massive interconnected ecosystem for the long haul. And that brings us right back to the state's number, 50%. See, for them, the focus isn't a single storm. It's the average amount of water that, by law and just by biological necessity, has to stay in the system every single year to keep the whole thing from falling apart. So the crucial point from the state's side is this, that 50% environmental flow is the bedrock of the entire system. It's what stops saltwater from poisoning the fresh water that goes to both farms and cities. Without it, the whole system just collapses. So it's not waste, it's a prerequisite. So who's right? The farmer watching 95% of a storm's water flow out to sea? Or the state managing a 50% average for the environment? The incredible answer is, they're both right. The problem isn't the facts, it's the system itself. This is where it all finally clicks into place. You see, the two numbers aren't actually fighting with each other because they're measuring completely different things. The state's 50% is a long-term annual average. The farmer's 95% is a snapshot taken during a very specific short-lived storm. In their own context, both figures are absolutely correct. Let's just walk through exactly how this happens. A massive storm hits, and it sends this huge pulse of fresh water into the delta. But if it's the wrong time of year for migrating fish, regulations slam the brakes on the pumps, and the system just has no extra storage, no place to put this sudden surplus of water. So with nowhere else to go,
all of that precious water gets flushed right out into the Pacific Ocean.
So you see, the real enemy here isn't a farmer or a regulator. It's a system with these rigid, inflexible rules and aging infrastructure that is trying and failing to cope with more and more extreme weather. The system just wasn't built for the huge, sudden downpours that climate change is throwing at it. And when a system fails like this, it doesn't just create frustration, it creates a political firestorm. And that is exactly what happened here.
This frustration went all the way to the top. In 2020, the Trump administration decided to take direct action. They basically rewrote the federal rulebook. It's called a biological opinion, or a BIOP, to allow a lot more water to be pumped south, siding pretty clearly with the farmers. So the new rules were finalized, but the fight was nowhere near over. The state of California, along with a bunch of environmental groups, immediately sued. They argued the new plan would violate the Endangered Species Act. And you know what? Those legal challenges have been successful, keeping the older, much stricter rules in place to this day.
The direct result of all that? The federal plan to send more water to the Central Valley was stopped dead in its tracks. It's just a powerful reminder of how incredibly difficult it is to change anything in California's water system, where every single drop is tangled up in this web of laws, regulations, and endless court battles.
Which leaves us with this fundamental question. This whole conflict between 95% and 50%, it isn't just a debate over numbers. It's a symptom of a much, much bigger problem. As droughts get drier and storms get wetter, can a water system that was built for the 20th century possibly survive the climate of the 21st? That right there, that's the real challenge ahead.